You know the story. A wooden horse, a stolen queen, a city burned to ash over the course of 10 brutal years. But what if almost none of that is true? What if the war you learned about in school was never really about Helen at all? Stay with this one, because the real story is stranger and far more human than the legend. For nearly 2,000 years, most scholars believed Troy was a myth, a poet's invention, a city that existed only in the words of Homer, sung around fires long after anyone who might have remembered it was dead. Troy was supposed to be fiction, filed away next to gods on mountaintops and monsters in labyrinths. Then, in 1870, an obsessive and controversial businessman named Heinrich Schliemann started digging into a hill in northwestern Turkey called Hisarlik, and he found a city. Not one city, actually. 9, stacked on top of each other like pages in a book, each one built on the ashes of the last. Somewhere in those layers, archaeologists believe, is the Troy that inspired the legend. So the city was real. But was the war? This is where the story gets complicated, and where most retellings quietly stop asking questions. Because a real city does not prove a real war. And a real war, if it happened, almost certainly did not happen the way Homer described it 400 years after the fact. Let's go back to what we actually know. Around 1200 BCE, something catastrophic swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Mighty civilizations collapsed within a few generations. The Hittite Empire, one of the most powerful states in the ancient world, disappeared almost entirely. Mycenaean Greece, home to the palace kings who supposedly sailed to Troy, fell into darkness so complete that writing itself was lost for centuries. Historian Eric Klein, who has spent decades studying this period, argues that this collapse wasn't caused by any single war or invasion. It was a perfect storm. Earthquakes, famine, mass migrations, trade networks breaking down all at once like dominoes no one could stop. If a war at Troy happened, it happened inside this storm, not as some isolated 10-year siege fought purely over a woman's honor. So why Helen? Why a stolen queen and a jealous husband? Ancient warfare was rarely about love. It was about control. Troy sat at one of the most valuable crossroads on Earth, guarding the narrow strait that connected the Aegean Sea to the Black Sea. Every ship moving grain, timber, metal, or slaves through that region had to pass close enough to Troy's walls to be taxed, threatened, or turned away. Whoever held Troy held a chokehold on trade routes worth more than any single kingdom's treasury. Doesn't that sound like a better motive for a decade of warfare than a runaway wife? Here's where it gets even more interesting. German archaeologist Manfred Korfmann led major excavations at Hisarlik, starting in the 1980s, and what his team uncovered changed the debate entirely. Troy was bigger than anyone expected, much bigger. Earlier digs had only found a small citadel, a fortress fit for a minor lord. Korfmann's team found an extensive lower city surrounding it, protected by a defensive ditch cut into bedrock, large enough to have housed thousands of people. This wasn't a village with delusions of grandeur. This was a real regional power, a city worth fighting over. But not every scholar agreed. Historian Frank Cole publicly challenged Korfmann's conclusions, arguing the evidence for a large, wealthy trading city was overstated, and that Troy may have been more modest than the excavation team claimed. The disagreement grew heated enough to make headlines in Germany, splitting the archaeological community into two camps. One side saw a glittering Bronze Age capital. The other saw an ambitious reconstruction stretched beyond what the dirt could actually prove. Who was right? The truth, as usual, sits somewhere in the space between certainty and doubt. Later excavation seasons uncovered more of that lower city, along with evidence of destruction layers, burned buildings, scattered weapons, and human remains from around the time scholars associate with the legendary war. Something violent happened at Troy near the end of the Bronze Age. That much the evidence supports. What triggered it, whether it was a single dramatic siege or a slow grinding series of conflicts over generations, is where the sources go quiet. Now think about how the story survived at all. There was no war reporter standing on the walls of Troy taking notes, no stone tablet listing the true causes of the conflict for future historians to translate. What we have instead is memory, filtered through centuries of retelling before it was ever written down. Homer's Iliad wasn't composed during the Bronze Age. It was composed roughly 400 years after any war at Troy would have ended, passed down orally by generations of poets, each one shaping the story a little differently for their own audience. Kings became legendary heroes. Trade disputes became personal vendettas. A queen who may have symbolized political alliance became a woman worth burning a city for. Isn't it strange how a story can stay recognizable across 4 centuries and still become almost unrecognizable in its meaning? There's a deeper pattern here, one archaeologists see again and again at sites across the ancient world. Real events get compressed into single dramatic moments because that's how memory works.